A poor, black, single mother, Amani Carter, had only her old car to keep her life afloat and take her child to school. But a corrupt cop destroyed that very car in the middle of the street and framed her as a criminal. Desperate, she had no choice but to call her brother, Chris, a former Green Berets sniper. When Chris returned, he realized this wasn't just a random act of harassment. It was part of a dirty power network tightening its grip on people of color. And this time, they picked the wrong person to mess with. What will Chris do to bring the truth to light? Can justice break through a system hiding in the shadows for too long? Let us know where you're watching this from, and stay tuned until the end to find out. In a quiet corner of southern Kentucky, the town of Fairhill had little to mark its place on the map of America, except for an air thick with prejudice and a set of unwritten rules that everyone understood but no one dared to name. In a cramped neighborhood lined with weathered wooden houses faded by time, Amani Carter began her morning like she always did, with an alarm blaring at 5 a.m., and the low groan of legs still aching from last night's shift. Amani was a single mother to Julia, a sharp 11-year-old who had already learned to stay quiet in a place where people judged your worth by the color of your skin. And Amani, a black woman with coiled hair tied back in a worn plastic clip, dressed in a wrinkled dark uniform and a name tag that read Imani, associate, worked the retail floor at Value Mart, a chain where people bought everything cheap but still expected 5-star service. That morning, as sunlight barely pierced through her torn curtain, Amani quietly backed her 2006 Ford Focus out of the dirt patch in front of her house. The car, a relic clinging to life, groaned with each turn of the key, but it was her greatest asset, the one thing tying together her job, Julia's school, and the daily demands of single motherhood caught between survival and exhaustion. At rush hour, Value Mart turned into a battlefield. Customers jostled, barcode scanners beeped nonstop, and crying children blended with relentless complaints. Amani stood at checkout lane 4, the least convenient spot, as her manager had told her on her first day. A middle-aged white woman with overly bright dyed blonde hair tossed a few grocery items onto the conveyor and barked, "Can you go any faster? I came to shop, not to watch you learn how to use a register." Amani bit her lip and kept scanning and bagging. She was used to that tone. It wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last, time she heard comments like that, especially from people who looked at her as if her very existence was an inconvenience. Behind the woman, a man sighed loudly and muttered just loud enough for all to hear, "Should have picked a different line. Hiring these welfare cases and making customers pay the price." Amani looked up, her eyes flashing for a brief second like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Then she looked down again and kept working, as if she hadn't heard a thing. She knew one word back could cost her the job. In Fairhill, a black woman's reaction could be labeled aggressive or unprofessional far quicker than any customer's blatant disrespect. She left work earlier than usual that day to pick up Julia from tutoring at the community center. Amani thanked her manager, even though he didn't lift his eyes from his phone. She hurried across the parking lot under the sharp, dry sunlight of late spring, where her Focus was already radiating heat from its flaking silver paint. It took 3 tries before the engine turned over, coughing like a wounded animal. She yanked the wheel hard, pulling out onto the street, silently praying, "Just don't die on me today." But fate rarely showed mercy to people like her, and something was already quietly taking shape. On the other end of the line, Julia was calling, "Mom, I got out early. The teacher said you need to pick me up on time today." Amani nodded, even though no one could see her, then pressed the gas with the familiar struggle of the old engine. Driving out of the neighborhood, she passed a rusted sign that read, "Welcome, to Fairhill, where values still matter." A slogan meant to sound noble, but painfully ironic to anyone who'd never been treated as fully human here. The road ahead was bright with sunlight, but in Amani's mind a shadow passed. A strange feeling crept in, as if today her endurance would be tested to its limit, and those unwritten rules were about to show their true face. The Ford Focus trembled like a dying creature as Amani barely managed to pick up Julia at the community center. The 11-year-old climbed into the car with a heavy backpack and sweat on her brow, but her face lit up with a smile when she saw her mother. That brief moment was a rare glimmer of light in Amani's otherwise murky days. She gently brushed her daughter's hair and said, "Sorry I'm late again. The car's acting up." Julia shook her head, waved goodbye to her classmates, then pulled out a lunchbox her teacher had packed. "I saved this for you, Mom. You haven't eaten, right?" Amani smiled, warmth flickering in her chest, but they had barely turned a corner when the car made a dry pop sound. The engine stalled mid-traffic, choked silent. She stepped on the gas once, twice, nothing. The car sat motionless in the middle of a busy lane like an abandoned object. Behind her, car horns started blaring. A red pickup swerved past. The driver, a middle-aged white man, stuck his head out and yelled, "Get that piece of junk off the road, you welfare leech." Julia lowered her gaze. Amani gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing the words out of her mind. She turned on the hazard lights, stepped out, and popped the hood, hoping against hope that something was just loose. But the car sat there, lifeless, as if it knew its place and had chosen to surrender. Just then, a patrol car appeared, red and blue lights flashing. Two white officers stepped out, the one in front, tall, crew-cut blonde, with a scowl that traveled ahead of him. His name tag gleamed, Seth Jones. The younger one followed, more hesitant in his steps, W. Wilson. Jones strode forward, his tone dry and unwelcoming. "What's going on here? Your car's blocking an entire lane." Amani stood upright and kept her voice calm. "My engine died. I'm just trying to restart it. I'll call for roadside." "License?" Jones cut her off, already placing his hand near his belt, right by his gun. Amani froze. The way he looked at her, it was like staring down a criminal. She slowly reached for her wallet, pulled out her license, and stayed composed despite the tremble in her fingers. "Here, I have insurance, registration too, if you need to." "What kind of insurance?" "State-issued?" Jones sneered, contempt flickering in his eyes. Wilson stepped closer, his gaze settling on Julia, still sitting inside, confused and watching through the glass. Amani noticed and grew nervous, afraid her daughter might be dragged into this. She quickly said, "Please, my daughter's scared. We're not causing trouble. It's just a breakdown." But those words seemed to ignite something. Jones let out a dry laugh. "Always the same excuses. It's the car, the system, society, when really, it's just not knowing how to behave in public." His voice was coarse, laced with disdain, each word feeling like a sentence passed on her entire community. A cold spring wind passed through, but the chill in Amani's chest was far worse. She held her composure, but her throat tightened as she saw Julia clutching the window from the back seat. "I haven't broken any laws, I just—" Amani began. But Jones wasn't listening. He cut her off again. "Imani Carter." "Oh, that name rings a bell." He emphasized every syllable, looking at the ID in her hand. "Didn't you get a parking ticket last year?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. Amani clenched her jaw, anger rising, but she forced her voice steady. "That was paid, and it's not relevant." Jones's eyes now gleamed like a predator catching scent. He turned to Wilson, voice sharp. "I think we need to search her vehicle. Get the light, check under the car and the trunk, watch for contraband." Amani gasped, her eyes widening as if someone had poured ice water over her face. She stepped forward in alarm. "What? This is too much. My daughter is here." Her voice rang through the street like a warning bell. but no one listened. Passers-by glanced and walked faster, avoiding her eyes as if injustice were contagious. Jones turned back and stepped toward her, close enough for Amani to smell the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his uniform, bitter and suffocating. His eyes were cold mirrors, reflecting no trace of humanity. "You're obstructing a police investigation," he said slowly, deliberately, like a sentence already written. Amani stepped back half a pace, heart racing. Before she could respond, his voice snapped again. "I said, turn around. Hands behind your head." She barely had time to process before she was spun around, her arms wrenched back. Julia's eyes went wide, her hands trembling against the glass. The girl flung open the door, shouting, "Mom, you didn't do anything. Julia, stay in the car. Don't come out," Amani yelled, her voice cracking as cold steel cuffs tightened around her wrists. Jones glanced at Julia, the same look he'd given her mother. "Get her out of the car." Wilson hesitated. "She's just a kid." "I said, get her out." Amani struggled. "She didn't do anything. Please, I'm begging you." Wilson opened the door, but slowly. Julia backed away, gripping her phone tightly. Jones moved to the front of the car, bent down, then slammed his baton into the hood. "This junk's blocking public roads. Let me help clean it up." The sound of warping metal rang through the street. A few people stopped and stared, but no one intervened. Another blow, this time to the side mirror. Then one more. The headlight shattered. "Call a tow," Jones barked. "This thing belongs in a scrapyard." Amani had no tears left. She watched Julia being pulled from her seat, terror in her eyes, lips silently mouthing Mom. And Amani, cuffed, face pressed to the now dented hood, could feel the heat and the shame rising in her throat. Jones leaned in, hissed in her ear like a snake. "Welcome to Fairhill, where rules don't need to be written down." Amani shut her eyes. She could feel the whole town tightening its grip around her neck, but none of the adults knew. Inside Julia's hand, a phone had been recording the entire time. Under a sky turning a grim shade of gray in the late afternoon, the tow truck screeched away, tires grinding against the pavement, leaving behind only a mother and daughter standing in the echo of a fading engine. The old sedan, battered but vital, their only shelter in a cold winter, was now just a speck in the rearview mirror of those who claimed to uphold the law. Amani clutched Julia's hand. The girl's fingers were ice cold, but it wasn't the weather. It was the way the world had just laid bare a brutal truth. They had no right to be treated with dignity. They walked in silence, legs aching as they passed intersections they usually sped by in the car. Julia said nothing, just stayed close to her mother, head slightly down, eyes dry in a way no 11-year-old girl should be. As for Imani, each step weighed her down like she was dragging the future itself. What would happen tomorrow when she had no car to get to work? Who would care for or pick up Julia if everything collapsed? Imani glanced down at her daughter, wanting to pull her into an embrace but held back. Something in Julia's silence scared her more than the sirens earlier. A normal child would cry, would ask why, would flail in fear. Julia didn't. She just walked, eyes on the road, shoulders upright like an adult. And when she could no longer hold it in, she finally spoke, soft, a blade slicing into her mother's heart. "Why did they do that to you?" Imani shivered. She realized Julia wasn't asking for answers. She was helping her mother find the words, because in Julia's eyes, when they met hers, was a depth of understanding no child should carry. Then, almost as if trying to protect her mother from seeing her hurt, Julia gave a dry, broken smile. "Maybe they were jealous of your car. I mean, it's old, but it's lasted almost 10 years. They probably couldn't handle that." Imani stopped in her tracks. The pain, crushed in her chest, burst into tears. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughter right there on the street, letting the cold wind lash their faces and strangers pass them by. "Julia," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." Julia stayed in her mother's arms, head gently leaning on her shoulder, voice light as mist. "You didn't do anything wrong, Mom. I hate the way they talk to you, like you weren't even a person. But I know you're the best person I've ever known." Amani broke down, mourning for a daughter who had been forced to grow strong far too soon. The old apartment in their low-income housing complex greeted them with the damp stench of mildew. Amani set down her bag, exhaling a long breath that didn't ease the weight inside her. Julia curled up in a corner of the torn sofa, hugging her knees, while Amani quietly stepped into the kitchen, a cramped space with peeling walls and a gas stove that only lit with matches. She boiled water for instant noodles, the only thing left besides a few ice cubes and an expired carton piece of milk. There would be no peaceful sleep tonight. Every time she looked at her daughter, Amani felt like a failure, a powerless mother, a citizen stepped on, a woman with nothing left but pride slowly eroding. Under the yellowish kitchen light, Amani took off her coat, hands trembling as she wiped away tears she hadn't noticed. She collapsed into the rickety wooden chair, back slumping as if her whole body had given out. Her shadow stretched across the stained wall, a silhouette of exhaustion. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. Her morning shift was tomorrow. If she wasn't on time, her schedule for the whole week could be erased. But without a car, getting to work was nearly impossible. The bus didn't run past the market, and Uber was out of reach on her minimum wage. In that moment, Amani felt a familiar dread rising. The same fear from the day her husband left, when she held newborn Julia and a shut-off notice for the electricity. But, unlike then, today she knew exactly what she was up against. Not just poverty, but a system that could strip her of dignity because of her skin, her name, the weight of prejudice she'd carried since before she could even speak. She turned toward her daughter, still trying to act strong, but Amani saw it. Julia was swallowing her fear. She stood, walked to her child, knelt, and gently placed her hand on Julia's knee. "Are you okay?" Julia nodded slightly, then looked up. "I'm okay, but I hate how they looked at you like that. You didn't do anything wrong." Amani pulled her into a hug, holding her tight in silence. Julia felt so small in her arms. It twisted something deep inside her. If she didn't protect her child from what was coming, who would? Night fell fast. Once Julia was asleep, Amani crept into the kitchen. She picked up her old phone, its screen cracked at the corner, and scrolled through a contact list filled with names who no longer answered. Only one remained, like an old scar that had never healed. Chris. Amani stared at the name, thumb hovering. Her brother's face flashed in her mind. Silent, hardened, always carrying a darkness no one could explain. It had been years since she last called him. The brother she once swore never to ask for help again. The one whose past with her was marked by fractures and silence. But now, with the world closing in, with justice and trust feeling like luxuries she could no longer afford, she knew she had no other choice. Amani closed her eyes for a second, took a breath, and hit the dial. The ringtone buzzed, once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. "Hello?" The voice was low, rough, and distant. Amani gripped the phone, her voice breaking like a deep, open wound. "Chris, I need you." On a night bus from Columbus to Fairhill, Chris Walker sat motionless by the window, his eyes locked on the darkness outside as if searching through the shadows within himself. How long has it been since he last came back to this town? A place filled with memories, both beautiful and painful. The birthplace of family bonds and the fire that scorched forgiveness from his heart. Chris had once been the family's pride, a top sniper in the Special Forces, the kind of man whose teammates trusted him with a glance. In Fairhill, Amani jolted awake from the armchair near the kitchen, startled by a knock at the door. She rose and opened it. Standing before her was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn military jacket and boots dusted with red clay from the road. His buzz-cut hair and eyes, sharp like a blade honed 1,000 times. Yet at the corners of those eyes was something that made Amani freeze. Something old, familiar, and aching. "Chris," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Chris glanced down the shabby hallway, the crack in the ceiling and the dim light spilling from the kitchen, as if silently capturing the full frame of his sister's life. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Amani stepped aside without a word. Chris entered, removed his boots, and set his backpack down with the quiet instinct of a soldier. He scanned the kitchen, stopping at a crayon drawing taped to the wall. "Mom is my hero. I didn't think you'd get here this fast," Amani said, still clutching the collar of her robe. "Your voice on the phone." He paused, eyes flickering with something he couldn't name. "It wasn't the Amani I used to know." Amani pressed her lips together. "Because the old Amani knew how to tough it out and never asked for help. Because the old Amani didn't have a child," Chris corrected, glancing toward Julia sleeping soundly. "Now you have someone who needs you stronger than ever." Amani sat across from him. The air between them thickened like a fine mist at night. She knew there were wounds between them that hadn't healed. The fights, the silence, and especially that year she chose to love a man Chris warned her was no good, and like he said, the man vanished before Julia even learned to say Dad. "You hated me for choosing the wrong person," she murmured. "No," Chris shook his head. "I was angry because you didn't let me be there when it all fell apart." Amani looked down. "Back then, I felt like I deserved it. I thought I'd disgraced the family, ruined everything. I didn't want to drag you into it." Chris gave a dry laugh. "I've lived with sniper rifles, venomous snakes, and cartel runners in the Middle East. You think a stubborn little sister scared me?" For the first time, Amani let out a laugh, quiet, like a door creaking open in the night, but there was release in it. Chris smiled too, then looked at her more seriously. "What happened, Amani?" he asked, and she told him, from being insulted by customers at work to being handcuffed on the street and watching her only car get destroyed without cause. But what hit Chris hardest wasn't the abuse of power. It was Amani's face when she spoke about Julia. The hurt, the fury, the helplessness. "She saw everything," she said, eyes wet. "She held on to me and didn't know what to do. I felt like a failure." Chris clenched his fist. He had seen fathers in war zones watch their children taken and do nothing. And now, his sister, a woman who had never held a weapon, was being shamed in the middle of a country that never stopped preaching about freedom. He stood and walked to the window, where the streetlight blurred through the stains on the glass. His back was straight like a soldier in formation, but his eyes were torn. He was no longer in uniform, but his skills and network were intact, and he couldn't let anyone harm his family. He stepped forward, placed a firm yet gentle hand on Amani's shoulder. "This time, I'm not letting it slide." Amani stood in the kitchen, clutching a dish towel that had stopped moving the moment Chris asked his question. He leaned against the doorway, the warm yellow light casting shadows across the lines of experience carved into his face. A soft spring wind slipped through the cracked window, carrying the damp scent of a poor street after night rain. "Which cop did this to you?" Chris asked again, voice low but firm like steel. Amani hesitated. She turned her back, folded the towel neatly, then answered, keeping her tone level. "Seth Jones, and a younger officer named Wilson." She didn't see Chris's face then, but the air in the kitchen seemed to dip in pressure. The wooden chair creaked as he pulled it out and sat, fingers laced together on the table like he was holding something inside. "Jones?" Chris repeated slowly, his lips tightening. Just hearing that name pulled his mind backward through decades, back to his high school days when his backpack was full of books and hope, back when he was one of the few black kids starting for the school's soccer team, a school full of white students, white teachers, and a town that never admitted its prejudice. He remembered the championship game, the feel of the ball on his foot, the slicing diagonal pass, and the long curling shot that flew into the net. The crowd exploded. Teammates rushed the field. The coach hugged him. The local paper called him a rising star of the South. But off to the side, behind the stadium, Seth Jones stared at him with a look that burned, resentful, bitter, and full of quiet hate. Jones was the son of a local ex-military security officer. That game, he played defense for the opposing team. Big, rough, and hyped as the next big thing, but Chris had danced past him 3 times that day. And for someone like Jones, public humiliation was an unforgivable sin. The next afternoon, walking home through a narrow alley after practice, 4 shadows leapt from a brick wall. A fist slammed into his chest, followed by kicks, elbows, and knees. Chris fought back, but he was outnumbered and beaten down. In the dizzy blur of blood and rain, he saw Jones's face inches from his, breath reeking of cigarettes. "Think being good gives you the right to shine, huh, you black piece of trash?" Chris never told his mother, never filed a report. He knew no one would believe a black kid accusing a group of white boys in a town like theirs. He stayed silent, wrapped his broken ribs, swallowed his rage, and buried himself in training, vowing no one would ever break him again. Years later, Chris heard Jones had failed the military entrance exams. A guy like him, arrogant, reckless, lacking both discipline and intelligence, was never going to pass. Meanwhile, Chris, the one they jumped in the alley, was accepted into elite sniper units, trained with special ops, and deployed in missions so classified that the files were still sealed. That memory resurfaced like a cold blade against his spine. And now, to hear the name Jones again, inside this dim little house, every piece snapped back into place. A white cop, a town full of bias. A black woman was humiliated in public, and Julia, his little niece, had seen it all. Chris gripped the chair arm until his knuckles went white. This wasn't just anger. It was recognition. The same boy who once attacked him for daring to outshine now wore a badge and held real power. No more alley beatings. This was institutional violence, cloaked in authority, dressed as order. Walker. Chris whispered his name, as if testing how it would sound echoing in Jones's mind. A warning bell, or an unfinished curse. Under the quiet night sky that seemed to conceal something rotten beneath its stillness, Chris stood 1 block away from the city impound lot, shoulders draped in a worn military jacket, eyes locked through a compact monocular disguised in a common casing. He hadn't been able to sit still since hearing Amani's story, and he couldn't ignore what he saw that morning. His sister's sedan abandoned like a piece of junk, its front unnaturally crushed. He knew damage like that couldn't have come just from a tow. Under the dull glow of floodlights, rows of impounded cars sat like discarded victims, each bearing scars of abuse. Dents from iron tools, broken glass still scattered inside, taillights removed for no clear reason. Chris held his breath as he watched 2 men in reflective vests, caps pulled low, hovering around a new model SUV. They opened the hood, pulled something out. Quick, precise, and stealthy like seasoned thieves. He backed away, following the rusted barbed wire fence, crouching near a large dumpster. From this spot, he spotted a green container tucked behind a line of storage sheds, conveniently placed where no cameras pointed. The 2 men began loading heavy wooden crates onto the container truck. Boxes, filled with auto parts stripped from impounded vehicles. Through the monocular, Chris squinted. He saw 3 others, likely 2 yard workers, ripping open the hood of a sedan. They pulled the battery, yanked the central control unit, and tossed them onto the floor of the container like fulfilling an order. One of them took out a phone and muttered, "That's 3 done." Chris reached into his jacket for a special phone, a covert device he kept from his operations days, activated its infrared recording mode, and began capturing everything. Faces lit up in the thermal glow. Every move of the smuggling operation played out like missions he once dismantled overseas. The only difference now was that the enemy wore badges, council pins, and the hollow title of vehicle enforcement. He recorded a full sequence. Cars towed in, stripped of parts, sorted, then loaded for sale. High-value items, generators, lithium batteries, multimedia consoles were marked on a clipboard, tagged with under-the-table prices. It was organized. It was systematic. And worst of all, it had backing from people in power. By dawn, when the workers had cleared out, Chris slipped through a hole in the fence, likely broken by someone trying to escape before, and crept inside. The air was thick with oil and rust, but heavier than the stench was the sense that this place wasn't just physically corroded, it was morally bankrupt. He paused before a gutted pickup, leather seats slashed, steering wheel stripped, touchscreen gone without a trace. On the floor, a crumpled slip of paper marked with a blood-stained case number. Chris narrowed his eyes, heart pounding as he punched that number into the city's vehicle registry. The car had belonged to a man named Jermaine Lowe, a delivery driver arrested for a broken taillight. Chris tried other tags from nearby cars and saw a chilling pattern. Most of the impounded vehicles belonged to Black or Latino drivers from low-income neighborhoods. Every path led to one conclusion. This wasn't just corruption. It was a machine of selective targeting, filtering victims by race and class. He moved toward the warehouse at the back of the lot. The lock was old. With a thin copper wire and a pair of pliers, Chris had it undone in under 3 minutes, just like old missions. The door groaned open to reveal a pitch-black space filled with disassembled car parts, engines, wheels, even VIN plates cut from frames. On the wall, a whiteboard sketched a network map, neighborhoods, vehicle owners, seizure statuses, and responsible officers. It was a hit list. Chris snapped photos of every detail. Then one name hit him in the gut. Northside, Carter, 314, processed. His chest sank. This wasn't random. His sister had been on the list. She had been marked. Before sunrise, Chris stood atop a hill looking down on the town still veiled in morning mist. His fists clenched, rage rising with every heartbeat. He couldn't stand by while Amani and Julia were chewed up by this machine. And what infuriated him most was the familiar shape of it all. The cycle he'd seen in the military, where high-ranking men cut backroom deals with the enemy as long as it served them. He returned home before Julia woke. Amani sat, curled at the kitchen table, dark circles under her eyes after a sleepless night. Chris placed the phone on the table, pressed play. The video rolled. Amani stared, speechless, lips trembling, but no words came. Chris sat across from her, no longer just a brother who came to protect, but a man who had walked through darkness and was ready to walk back into it for his family. They didn't just wreck your car, Amani. They're wrecking the lives of people like you. And this time, I'm going all the way. The next morning, while Amani was folding old clothes to take to the laundromat, Chris sat in front of a laptop, eyes fixed on the footage he had recorded at the impound lot. He exhaled deeply. A soldier used to the deceptions of war, yet this battlefield was different. The enemy here wore legality like armor, and power didn't even bother to hide. As he annotated timestamps on each clip, a soft voice came from behind him, almost like a whisper. "What are you doing?" Chris turned. Julia stood there, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, but her eyes didn't match her 11 years. He gave a strained smile. "I'm investigating the people who wrecked your mom's car. Someone has to show them they were wrong." Julia hesitated for a moment. Then, suddenly, she stepped forward and placed her phone on the table. I recorded this. I didn't show Mom because I thought it would make her sad." Chris froze. He picked up the phone, his hands slightly trembling. On screen, a shaky, front-facing video came into focus. Jones looming over Imani, face cold, voice sharp with threats. Wilson rifled through the car, tearing open the trunk like he was hunting for planted contraband. And Imani pressed against the hood, shielding Julia from seeing too much. Chris stayed silent for a long time after watching. Not from surprise, but from the weight of it. He turned to Julia, eyes softening. "You're very smart. And brave, too. You know, thanks to you, this might come to light much sooner." Julia lowered her head, shy but with a quiet pride flickering in her gaze. Imani emerged from the kitchen, surprised to see her daughter next to her brother with an open phone in her hand. "Julia, what did you give your uncle?" Chris looked at his sister, speaking slowly. "You should see this. Then you'll understand why we can't let it go." Imani took the phone, and when the image of her in handcuffs appeared, her body wavered as if her balance had been pulled out from under her. She didn't cry, but her face tightened like it took everything not to break down. "You recorded this. When?" she asked quietly. "When they made you stand by the car. I didn't want you to see, but I was scared they might do something worse," Julia answered. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes, as they met her mother's, were filled with apology. Chris placed a firm but gentle hand on Imani's shoulder. "We're not alone anymore." That afternoon, as the sun began to fade behind the low rooftops of South Grove, Chris returned alone to the street where Imani's car had been taken. The tire marks were still etched into the cracked asphalt. He walked slowly, earbuds in, scanning the rows of houses. This was the kind of neighborhood where strange events often went unnoticed, but also where doorbell cameras caught everything from every angle. He carefully noted sight lines, checking each house for potential footage. In front of a red brick home with a low porch and withered vines, he paused. Chris rang the bell. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out, her silver hair tousled gently by the breeze. Samantha Henry, eyes cautious but not unkind. Chris introduced himself, said he was Imani Carter's brother, the woman who'd had her car impounded a few days earlier, and asked if her doorbell camera might have captured anything. Mrs. Henry was silent for a beat, studying Chris from head to toe, like she was looking past appearances and straight to intent. She didn't ask questions, just nodded, disappeared inside, and returned with a small USB drive sealed in a zip bag. "I don't like drama," she said, "but if someone needs to see the truth, this is what my porch saw." Chris left with the drive gripped tight, like holding a key. Back home, he plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered to life with the still street scene until the police SUV rolled into frame. Every step, every gesture from Jones and Wilson, every look of authority twisted into aggression was captured in high definition. Jones slammed his hand on the hood, glaring at Imani like she was a threat instead of a mother picking up her child. Chris didn't need more proof. What he was up against wasn't just a few corrupt cops. It was a system so normalized that no one questioned it anymore. He saved the footage in 3 encrypted copies, uploaded one to a secure server. The mission was no longer just about justice for his sister. It had become a command from within, a duty not to let this be buried in silence. An 11-year-old child had brought the truth to light. A neighbor had opened her door. And now, more clearly than ever, Chris understood. The powerless, when they stand together, are not powerless at all. Imani sat alone in the living room, the light from her laptop screen casting shadows across a face still weary from the past few days. Chris and Julia had gone to bed, but sleep wouldn't come for her. The small house felt tighter by the hour, wrapped in the invisible tension gripping all 3 of them. Even the faintest noise outside the window made her chest tighten. And yet, Inside her, something stronger than fear was rising, the unbearable weight of silence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clicked the record button. The webcam lit up, reflecting the image of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and only one thing worth protecting: the truth. "My name is Amani Carter. I'm a mother, a retail worker, and a citizen of this town. And I was stopped by police, had my only means of survival destroyed right in front of my daughter. We broke no law, but that didn't matter, because we're black, and for them, that was enough." She paused. Her breathing is uneven, her cheeks flushed from emotion held too long, but her eyes never wavered, staring straight into the camera, as if speaking directly to each person on the other side. "I've stayed silent for years, watching my friends, neighbors, and coworkers being treated like second-class citizens. I thought maybe if I just kept my head down and worked hard, I'd be spared. But that day, in the middle of a crowded street, I realized silence will never protect us." Amani ended the video with a line she hadn't prepared, but it cut through like a blade through pretense. "If any of you have ever been hurt like I was, let your voice be heard." She shut the laptop and uploaded the video to a small forum for families of color who'd experienced similar abuse. Then she sat still, hand frozen on the mouse as if afraid to let go. The silence stretched until the first share notification appeared, then another and another. The video wasn't viral yet, but it spread like small sparks slipping into the cracks of a community too used to fear and silence. The first message came from a woman named Latrice in Louisiana. "I know that feeling. I lost my car too, because my skin wasn't the right shade." But not all the messages brought comfort. The next morning, when Amani opened her phone, a flood of anonymous texts appeared. Some just a few words. "Shut up. We know where you live. Who do you think you are?" Others went further, including photos of Julia taken from a distance, alongside the tilted cross symbol long associated with hate-fueled threats. Amani trembled, but held herself together. She put the phone down and checked the windows, locking every door. Chris noticed how differently she moved through the house, more alert, more cautious, but he said nothing. He simply tightened the strap of the folding knife on his belt and checked the stun gun in his jacket. That afternoon, while Julia was doing her homework in her room, a sharp crash echoed from the living room. Glass shattered. A brick lay split on the floor. Scrawled across it was a crude target symbol, with Amani dead center. Amani stepped forward, barefoot, onto broken glass. Blood welled up from her foot, spreading across the tile, but she didn't react, as if the sting in her skin was nothing compared to the chill grip in her chest. Chris rushed in from outside. He saw the brick, then his sister's face, and said quietly, "It started." They didn't need to say more. They both knew this wasn't just about a wrecked car anymore, and the ones lurking in the shadows, the ones used to acting unseen, had just realized someone was shining a light on them. Darkness began to thicken around the small house, and for the first time Imani understood. Her voice wasn't just a spark of resistance, it was a beacon, and now it has become a target. That night, after Chris had taken Julia to stay with Mrs. Samantha for safety, Imani locked the door tightly and watched her brother unpack his gear with a kind of intensity she hadn't seen in years. He laid out a stun gun, a thick tablet loaded with specialized software, several portable hard drives, and a sleek gray earpiece. Imani leaned against the wall, arms crossed, voice low. "Chris, whatever you're about to do, is it even legal?" Chris didn't answer right away. His fingers moved across the compact keyboard attached to the tablet, opening a satellite map of the town's administrative grid. Red markers blinked across key locations: the impound lot, the Western warehouse, and the town hall. His eyes were sharp as blades, but his tone was calm, steady. "We've endured too much, Amani. This system's rotten to the core, If we wait for it to heal itself, you and Julia will be crushed long before justice even gets a chance to show up." Amani said nothing, torn between fear and gratitude. For the first time in years, she saw that look in her brother's eyes, the look of a man who'd risked his life in distant lands, not for a flag, but for the survival of those the world pushed to the edge. A soft beep sounded from the tablet. Chris glanced at the screen, put on the earpiece, and stood. "I'm meeting someone." "Who?" "Luke." Chris gave a faint smile. "He's the reason I'm not dead in Fallujah, and now I need his skills for something different." Half an hour later, Chris stood in front of a weathered red brick house tucked away in the working-class north side of a town. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, but the door creaked open after he knocked 3 times. 2 quick, 1 slow. A deep voice greeted him. "Walker, still breathing. That's something." Chris smiled as he stepped inside. The cluttered living room was home to a heavy-set man with tired eyes behind thick glasses, his fingers flying across 3 glowing monitors. Cables coiled like webs, and the floor was littered with hard drives, backup batteries, and old soda cans. Luke, a former cybersecurity specialist contracted by the military, once known for cracking enemy code in under 4 minutes, now lived like a digital ghost, but his mind was as sharp as ever. In front of them were hours of footage Chris had gathered from the impound lot. Cars, towed in during the day, vanishing at night, and unmarked trucks loaded under the cover of darkness. "I suspected a parts smuggling ring," Chris murmured as they slowed down a clip from 3 a.m. A hooded man checked paperwork and signed a clipboard for the truck driver. Luke paused, zoomed in on the document, enhancing each pixel. A faded logo emerged in the corner. Sunridge Solutions, LLC. "That rings a bell," Luke muttered, pulling the keyboard closer. Within a minute, a stream of data filled the screen. A Delaware-registered company. No office address, no staff. A shell company. Chris narrowed his eyes. "Pull the listed owner." A single click. One name appeared in bold. Victor Rohr. They exchanged a glance. Chris leaned back, fist clenched. Victor Rohr, currently a town councilman, a polished figure at community meetings with soothing words and a practiced smile. Outwardly, an advocate for development in poor neighborhoods, privately, the face of power twisted for profit. Luke kept digging, tracing the company's transactions, wire transfers, shipping manifests, falsified invoices, all masterfully forged, but no match for Luke's filter systems. Then, in a payroll document from Sunridge, a new name appeared under internal security. The signature read, E. Blake. Chris's pulse jumped. He took a breath. "Elijah Blake?" Luke nodded, eyes still on the screen. "Police chief." Signature matches the authorization forms for impound operations. They used fake VNs to report vehicles as destroyed, but in reality they stripped them for parts, sent them across state lines, and resold them. The money flowed to Rohr, Blake, and a network of proxy accounts. No more evidence was needed to confirm this wasn't petty corruption. It was a fully operational machine, greased and precise. The law had been distorted into a profit engine, and order was just a front for systemic rot. Chris muttered to himself, "They built a whole mechanism to legalize theft, aimed squarely at the poor and people of color." Luke backed up the entire system to encrypted drives, his expression darkening. They thought of everything, but what they didn't plan for was a sniper with a memory like a vault and nothing left to lose. Chris left the basement with the dossier in hand, his mind heavy, but his steps steady. When Amani saw the thick stack placed on the table, her eyes flickered between fear and recognition. "Chris, is it?" He nodded, voice low and resolute. "We just lifted the rug off this town, and underneath is a nest of vipers." The next day, while Chris was reviewing surveillance footage from the cameras he had placed around the impound lot. Something made him stop. Not an image, but a feeling. A strange intuition crept through his mind like a whisper from the dark. The sense of being watched. Not clear, but persistent. He didn't mention it to Amani. Instead, he quietly decided to drive Julia to school himself rather than let her take the bus like usual. That afternoon, as his beat-up SUV sat parked across from Roosevelt Elementary, Chris kept his eyes locked on the gate where children burst out like flocks of fledglings at the sound of the last bell. Julia was among the last to emerge, light-footed and hugging her thick notebook. But in that exact moment, Chris saw what he'd been bracing for. A patrol car, no lights, no siren, sat parked just 2 houses down from the school entrance. The driver didn't move. The windows were tinted, but low enough for Chris to see the smug face behind the wheel. Seth Jones. He wasn't smiling, just tilted his head slightly, watching Julia approach Chris's car with the casual air of a man who believed this was just another patrol. But that look, icy and relentless, was the same one Chris had seen years ago, lying bloodied on a football field with laughter ringing around him, Jones standing above. Chris gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. As Julia reached for the car door handle, he said quietly, "Wait a moment, get in." Then he stepped out and crossed the street, not quickly, not slowly, but with the full weight of years of restrained fury in every step. When he reached the driver's window, he tapped it twice, then stood upright, the window lowered halfway. Jones didn't look at him right away. He exhaled like a man amused by an unexpected show. "Didn't expect to see you here. Retired sniper, doing school pickup, new career path?" Chris didn't respond. His gaze bore into the man's ash-gray eyes, and his voice was low and sharp as a blade pressed to skin. "Next time you come near my niece, I won't use words." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Jones chuckled, a dry, soulless sound. "Cops have the right to patrol anywhere, especially areas with a history of violence or instability." Chris said nothing more, but the look in his eyes made Jones avert his gaze, just for a moment. And in that moment, for the first time, Chris saw something in Jones's eyes that wasn't hatred. It was unease. The cruiser rolled away slowly, like a predator unwilling to admit it had missed its prey. Chris watched it disappear behind a line of trees before returning to his car, where Julia sat quietly, a hint of worry in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Chris nodded, hand resting on the wheel as if to steady himself, but his eyes remained on the road where the patrol car had vanished. In that moment, fear didn't come from the possibility of a physical fight, but from the deeper realization that men like Seth Jones, given unchecked power, could do anything. No warrant, no cause, just the will to act. That night, after Julia had gone to sleep and Amani was cleaning the kitchen, Chris sat alone in the living room, the dim glow out of his desk lamp casting his shadow long across the wall. His mind turned over question after question. Why was Jones at the school? Was it just intimidation? Or was something else in motion? Why did he move like a man so comfortable in the dark, so far past the line of morality, he no longer remembered where it was? Chris opened a private browser and began tracing Seth Jones's public record. The official data was dry: graduated from Greenfield High, attended the State Police Academy, and was promoted after arresting an armed suspect 5 years prior. But when Chris dug deeper into older records and buried local news clippings on outdated archive sites, a familiar name appeared: Tom Jones. A small caption beneath a faded photo read, "CIA operative, killed in action in Kunduz, Afghanistan, 2014. In the comments section, Chris found a message from a relative in Greenfield. "Seth, we're proud of Tom. He was a hero." Chris sat still. The phone screen glowed softly in the kitchen light. Words like hero, fallen, and Kunduz echoed in his mind like a steady, rhythmic drum. His eyes slowly closed, and from deep inside, memories of that year rose like a tidal surge, long held at bay. Afghanistan, 2014, at the peak of chaos. They were deployed to Kunduz for a classified mission, to escort a special convoy from FOB to a Western fire base. But from the very start, Chris sensed something was off. No one knew exactly what was being transported. No one explained why the route kept changing or why there was no scheduled backup. And worse than the confusion was the presence of Tom Jones, a man with a CIA badge clipped to his chest, always flanked by Afghan advisors, but never once truly engaging with the soldiers. That day, the mission was abruptly rerouted. The convoy was caught in an open valley, no cover, no exit route. A UAV circling above mysteriously lost signal at the exact wrong moment. Chris, posted on the eastern ridge as a sniper, received one final transmission. Hold position. Do not fire without command. Then, silence. Through his scope, Chris saw the entire scene unravel. Bullets raked through the convoy, 2 support soldiers dropped, and smoke and fire surged from the lead Humvee. But what made Chris's blood run cold wasn't the ambush. It was Tom Jones, unharmed, pulling a Glock 19 from inside his jacket and shooting a wounded U.S. soldier in cold blood before vanishing behind a cargo truck. It wasn't self-defense. He was silencing a witness. Chris didn't hesitate. One pull of the trigger from the ridge, and the bullet flew like a bolt of lightning. Tom collapsed behind the truck, eyes wide open, never even registering what had hit him. It all happened in under 8 seconds. 3 hours later, Chris was ordered back to base. The official report, CIA operative Tom Jones killed in action. But inside the debrief room, dim lighting and silence heavier than any punishment, Chris knew he had crossed a line. No one else saw him shoot that soldier, did they? The counterintelligence officer asked, voice calm, almost gentle, but laced with threat. Chris remained silent. You fired on a federal asset in a joint operation. You know what that means, don't you? Chris remembered clenching his fists so tight his nails drew blood. He wanted to scream, to smash that cold steel table, but he also knew the rules were already written. The CIA never admitted that one of their own executed an Allied soldier, especially not in a mission tied to covert ops. If Chris told the truth, the entire operation and the massive intelligence apparatus built around it would come crashing down. He was sent back stateside. No press release, no ceremony, no honorable discharge, just one line in his military record. Retired under special recommendation. Months later, he received a suggestion from a visiting captain. If you're smart, you'll never bring up Afghanistan again. For your good and your family's. Chris had never told Amani. Never told anyone. He had tried to forget it. Tried to bury it beneath the rubble of memory and nightmares. But now, seeing Julia's face in Jones's crosshairs, seeing Tom Jones's name appear again, it was as if the final puzzle piece had just clicked into place. The car was destroyed. Amani's wrongful arrest, the threats, the brick, the target symbol. None of it was a coincidence. It was retaliation, not just for their skin, but for blood. The blood of a brother silenced to protect secrets, and a system that had gotten its hands dirty in the dark, now circling back to crush anyone who dared speak the truth. Chris rose from his chair. His eyes no longer held panic. Only one thing burned behind the fatigue: resolve. He picked up the dossier, flipped to the first page, and wrote, Tom Jones, KIA report, cross-reference with 2014 logistics records, Kunduz sector. On the wall, Julia had just taped up a new drawing, a black man standing in front of a storm, shielding a girl who held her mother's hand. Chris looked up at it, then whispered to himself, "This time, I'll dig until I hit the roots." And that night, inside a worn-down house whose walls had long grown used to silence, his breathing no longer trembled. Only his heartbeat echoed now, steady and unshakable, like it once did on the battlefield, back when no one behind him was ever allowed to fall. Elsewhere in town, Wilson sat frozen behind the wheel of his car, hands clenching the steering wheel so tightly that veins bulged beneath the dim light of the police department's rear parking lot. Cold sweat traced his temples, despite the dry December chill blanketing the Midwest. Inside the vehicle, the world felt muffled beneath the heavy drum of his heartbeat. Years at the academy, all those ideals about justice and service, now scattered shards across the dashboard of his conscience. Ever since that patrol with Jones, when Imani Carter was handcuffed in broad daylight, her car demolished, her daughter frozen silent like a ghost, something inside Wilson had fractured. At first, it was only a hairline crack, like the beginning of a windshield fracture, but the images wouldn't fade. They clung to him, surfacing in dreams, staring back at him every time he looked in a mirror. What haunted him most was Julia's silence. Not the cries, not the pleading, just her quiet eyes, filled with a fear that had long been normalized by the very system sworn to protect her. Wilson no longer saw glory in the badge he once wore with pride. In meetings with Jones, he began noticing the smirks, the side glances, the way reports were edited before being sent up the chain. Then came the internal memo, marked special surveillance zones, and there it was, Imani's home address. No signature, just a PDF and a system code. But Wilson knew exactly who had written it. That was the moment, the line. He could either keep turning away like the rest, or step across into the unknown. 3 days later, he found himself at a small cafe near the intercity bus terminal, where Chris Walker was scheduled to drop Julia off at martial arts class. Rain fell in a thin drizzle. Chris was already inside, facing away from the window, sipping a mug of thick black coffee. When Wilson entered, their eyes met. A flicker of suspicion, then a slow nod from Chris, as if he'd seen this coming. Wilson sat down without ordering. From his worn shoulder bag, he pulled out a hard drive, a battered folder of documents, and a small USB stick. "It's all in here," he said, voice low and uneven. Internal impound, footage, the vehicle list, emails from upstairs, and a scan of the report Jones tried to erase. Chris didn't ask questions. He opened his laptop, reviewing each file in silence. Every click revealed another slice of rot. Photos of stripped cars, forged impound orders, irregular patrol logs. One email included the note, "Transfer vehicle number 4289 to temporary bay, A under special directive. Do not enter into the system." Chris turned to him. His gaze wasn't sharp, it was quiet, respectful. He didn't ask why Wilson was doing this. He already knew. It took more than courage for a rookie cop, less than 3 years in uniform, to turn on his own. That night, Chris brought Wilson to meet Aaron Mitchell, a black detective once suspended for probing too deeply into civil rights violations. Aaron lived behind a laundromat, her cramped apartment papered with evidence boards, case files, and red ink chains of suspicious financial flows. She studied Wilson for a long moment, but when she saw the hard drive in his hand, her expression softened. She dropped into her chair, slipped on her glasses, and got to work without a word. Beneath the cold glow of the desk lamp, 3 people, once on different sides, were now united by a single truth. The system they believed in was rotten from the inside out. Wilson didn't speak much. He just handed over files, videos, and notes he'd quietly saved for weeks. Every time he hit send, his fingers trembled, not from fear of being caught, but from knowing this would alter his life forever. After 3 hours, Aaron finally leaned back with a sigh. We've got a network, but not enough to bring it down. We need a name, a confession, someone in the dark, willing to step into the light. Wilson looked up, eyes filled with sadness, but also certainty. If someone needs to do it, I'll go first. Chris said nothing, just placed a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, something flickered inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. That night, none of them slept. Chris, Aaron, and Wilson sat together, cross-referencing files, connecting fragments. And in the spaces between old wounds, a new beginning took shape, a battle gaining reinforcements from within the very machine they sought to dismantle. People once thought powerless, now standing together, could draw a line loud enough to be heard by the world. And for the first time in a long time, Chris believed, this time, they might just win. The apartment complex where Amani and Julia lived had always been cramped and run down. But that night, every brick, every peeling wall seemed to hum with menace. There was no fire alarm, no gas leak warning, only the sound of breaking glass, a flash of light from the kitchen window, and then flames erupting as if they'd been waiting. Amani jolted awake from a restless dream, coughing violently as smoke filled her lungs. Julia lay curled beside her, eyes wide with fear, too stunned to speak. Chris slammed open the bedroom door, his voice booming like thunder. Fire! Get out! Now! The three of them rushed into the hallway, thick with smoke. An explosion from the kitchen rocked the walls like a fist to the chest. Glass shattered. Orange-red light coated the ceiling like a descending hell. Chris threw his arm around Julia, lifting her with ease, while Amani clung close behind, her slippers lost somewhere in the chaos. The narrow hallway stretched like a tunnel in a nightmare. Flames licked the stairwell. Each step was a struggle against the heat. A neighbor screamed from the next apartment, but the cry was quickly swallowed by smoke. Chris kicked open the emergency door, carrying Julia like she weighed nothing more than a school bag. They ran across the front lawn just as the second-floor ceiling collapsed behind them. Amani collapsed on the curb, coughing uncontrollably, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Julia trembled in her mother's arms, refusing to look back. A crowd began to gather, but no one dared get close. The fire trucks arrived late, suspiciously late. Chris scanned the street, eyes sharp as if he'd just stared death in the face. He knew this wasn't an accident. As firefighters battled the blaze at Unit 8C, what used to be their last haven, Chris ran 2 blocks to where Luke's truck was parked. The engineer stumbled out, clutching a massive backpack like it held his life. I brought the drives. Just a hunch, Luke panted, eyes red from the smoke. All the backup data. They didn't wipe anything. Chris said nothing. He placed a firm hand on Luke's shoulder, a silent thank you. Amani approached, Julia gripping her dress tightly, eyes brimming with tears as she stared at the gray ash drifting from the sky like burnt snow. She whispered, so softly only Amani could hear, "Mom, they're trying to kill us, aren't they?" Amani had no answer. Her arms tightened around her daughter, hands trembling, not from cold, but from the truth Julia had voiced. It was the same truth Amani had felt creeping closer with each anonymous message, each broken window, each stare from Jones. And now, fire. At that moment, Julia was no longer just an 11-year-old girl. She stood in a world where even grown adults faltered. The fire in her eyes reflected not just the loss of a home, but the first sparks of a spirit hardening in the heat of injustice. Chris turned back, voice low and sharp like a blade pulled from flame. They wanted to put out a fire, but they don't know. Sometimes, the strongest flames are born from ashes, and that night, as the blaze died down, the three of them stood in silence amid the cold crowd. None of them spoke, but inside, something was rising, something that couldn't be burned away, something that would become a fire no one could put out. On the northern ridge of town, inside a small wooden cabin that Luke had converted into his digital hideout, the glow of dozens of monitors reflected off Chris's steady face. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, rustling like it wanted to sweep away the secrets Fairview had buried for years. But inside, another storm was brewing, not of wind or thunder, but of data, images, money trails, and confessions, all waiting to be unleashed. Chris bent over one final time to review the dossier he and Luke had compiled over weeks. Financial records, internal emails, lists of impounded vehicles with their owners' addresses, all pointing to a chilling pattern. Most of the victims were people of color, living in low-income neighborhoods without lawyers, without anyone to fight for them. Beside it lay a map Luke had just completed. Every red dot marked a stolen car, every line traced the backdoor delivery routes disguised under the fake name Sunridge Solutions, LLC. Chris stood, glancing out the window. In the pale dark beyond the trees sat Imani's new house, or rather, their temporary shelter. Since the fire, Julia hadn't slept through a single night. Every small noise made her jump. Imani looked thinner, worn, but her eyes still carried a flame, the kind only a mother could ignite when fear threatened her family. Behind him, Luke spoke without turning, voice steady but tense. Everything's ready. One click, and it's mirrored on international servers. Not even the FBI or NSA can take it down. You sure? Chris nodded. No hesitation. Luke pressed the key. Within seconds, their files hit 3 independent justice forums, platforms monitored by journalists, lawyers, and civil rights advocates. Social media lit up with headlines. What's happening in Fairview? Illegal vehicle seizure network exposed. Ties revealed between city council and police chief. But that wasn't the heavy blow. Not yet. Chris looked at Luke, then pulled out a small USB. On it was a video of Nate Mendez, an unremarkable tow truck driver, a name no one remembered. But today, Nate chose to speak. The screen lit with his gaunt face, the dim sidelight casting a cold glow. His voice trembled slightly, but was clear. My name is Nate Mendez. I used to work for the towing company contracted by the city. Over the last 3 years, I towed more than 400 cars from low-income neighborhoods, mostly Black and Latino families. The reasons were always things like illegal parking, expired tags, or suspected activity. But most of it was a lie. Orders came straight from the police department, specifically Lieutenant Seth Jones. We were paid extra to keep it quiet. Nate paused, then held up a stack of invoices and photos. These are the payments I kept copies of, from a company called Sunridge Solutions, which is a shell under Councilman Victor Rohr. And who oversaw the whole operation? Chief Elijah Blake. He called it a joint initiative to protect public assets. But it was daylight robbery. Chris watched the 12-minute video like every word was a nail in a coffin. It ended with a whisper, almost like a plea. I know they'll find me, maybe in a few hours, but if someone's listening, please help Imani Carter and her daughter. They're just victims in a game of power I once helped run. Luke didn't wait. He added an independent journalist watermark and uploaded the video to YouTube, Reddit, X, and several decentralized platforms. The post included the full documentation, maps, and photos from the impound lot, where dozens of vehicles had been stripped without ever being logged. Within 30 minutes, the post had thousands of shares. Journalists from Atlanta, Chicago, and even D.C. began asking questions. Former Fairview residents sent in their own stories. The system was cracking. Imani held Julia close as the first message pinged her phone. A woman named Valerie from Westwood recalled having her car towed the day her husband died even though it was legally parked. Another email told of a grandfather who lost his pickup while taking his grandson to a clinic. Julia trembled in her mother's arms, but her eyes glowed with something new: belief. Chris entered the room, placing a firm hand on Amani's shoulder. "We've started something. Now we finish it." On the other side of the screen, a storm had risen, and no one hiding in the dark would sleep soundly again. Chris left the cabin just 1 hour after the video went live. He drove through the night toward a roadside motel, a resting place for the drifting and the damned, where no transaction ever made it onto a receipt. Nate had agreed to meet him there, ready to share the final pieces of evidence not yet released. But when Chris stepped into the second-floor hallway and saw the door to room 209 slightly ajar, the first thing he noticed wasn't the stale smell of disinfectant. It was the choking blend of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and the sharp metallic scent of fresh blood. He pushed the door open. What he saw froze his breath in his chest. The room was dim, the curtains half drawn like someone had fled in haste. A weak lamp cast a dull glow across the stained carpet where Nate Mendez lay collapsed, a dark red bloom spreading beneath him. A pistol lay by his left hand, awkwardly placed, too deliberate. A torn scrap of paper nearby read only 3 shaky words: "I'm so sorry." Chris didn't need a second to understand. This wasn't suicide. It was a theater. He dropped to his knees, pulling Nate into his lap, pressing his hand over the bleeding wound in his shoulder. But it was too late. Nate's body trembled slightly, eyes wide and filled with terror. "Nate, it's me! Chris!" he shouted, voice cracking with desperation. Nate's lips quivered. With a final, strangled breath, he forced out 2 fractured words, each one slicing through the air like a blade. "Order," from Roar. Then silence. No breath, no heartbeat, just lifeless eyes, staring up at a ceiling stained with water damage, trying to cry out what his mouth could no longer say. Chris sat frozen, hands still clutching a wound that no longer bled. His eyes never left Nate's face, the same man who had been smiling just hours before, proud that his voice had finally reached tens of thousands. This was the cost of truth. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, only to hear a robotic message before the call was cut. Again, nothing. The line had been blocked. Chris had seen death on battlefields far from home, seen friends fall in silence, but this was different. This wasn't a war. This was a message. A message from men in suits and badges, letting the world know they could end anyone, anywhere, and reshape the story with a single falsified report. Chris stood, his hands soaked in blood. He scanned the room. Security cameras turned away, doorbell camera ripped from its mount. No sign of struggle. A crime scene designed to be perfect. He stood still, gaze darkening, and sent a message to Luke. "Wipe the cabin location. Protect the drives. Don't leave." But while Chris had gone to meet Nate, something else had unfolded. A tremor that shook the earth beneath them. Julia had been taken. It began as Amani stood on the porch, watching Chris's taillights disappear into the dark, gently pulling Julia's jacket over her shoulders. Her daughter, barely awake after a long, strained day. Amani brushed her daughter's hair back and said softly, "Go inside, sweetheart. I'll lock up." Julia nodded, stepping obediently into the cabin. She held her notebook, one filled with things no school ever taught: how to spot a tail, memorize license plates, and find the nearest exit. Chris had taught her, half joking, half serious, but Julia remembered it all. Amani hadn't even locked the door when her phone rang. A call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then picked up. The voice on the line was distorted, mechanical. "Count to 10, then turn around." Her chest tightened. She spun back toward the house. The room was empty. The couch where Julia had just sat was bare. Her notebook lay on the floor. The kitchen window gaped open. The curtain flapped like a hand waving goodbye. "Julia?" The scream tore from Amani's lungs like a blade through the soul. She bolted around the cabin, slipped on the slick wooden step, eyes scanning the dark. No tracks, no engine, no squeal of tires. They had come, and they were gone. In under a minute. Inside, Luke was monitoring systems when the scream rang out. He dashed outside, finding Amani collapsed on the ground, her face white, trembling. On the screen, every camera feed flickered the same message. Signal interrupted. This wasn't a chance. Someone had already breached the system and waited for Chris to leave. Amani's phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. She opened it, and her fingers went numb. The image was clear, cruel, surgical. Julia, hands bound, mouth taped, crouched in a windowless room under the pale glow of a fluorescent bulb. Her face pale, her eyes wide, staring directly into the lens, like she was trying to send a message. Beneath the photo, a single line. Surrender all data or receive the body. Amani dropped the phone. Her body disconnected from itself, no longer sure where her bones ended and skin began. Luke, trained for emergencies, stood paralyzed. He had never seen eyes, human eyes, so full of courage and cornered fear. When Chris returned and saw the cabin door wide open, every nerve in him screamed. He rushed in, Luke hammering keys. Amani crumpled on the floor like a tree torn from its roots. "Amani!" he shouted, dropping beside her. "Where's Julia?" She couldn't speak. She just handed him the phone. When Chris saw the photo, his entire body went still. No one heard his breath. It was too shallow. But his fists clenched, bones popping. His eyes that had scanned over battlefields and dead men, now saw only one thing. That little girl, his niece, taken by cowards. Erin entered then, stopping at the doorway. She said nothing, just looked at the screen, then at Chris. And Chris, after a moment of silence, walked to the corner, and pulled out an old backpack, drew his Glock, loaded the magazine, snapped it into the holster. His eyes no longer held grief. They made a decision. Someone had been chosen. Someone was going to pay. Wind whipped through the rusted tin roofs of the abandoned industrial warehouses on the southern edge of town, like the last breaths of a nightmare refusing to end. Chris stood cloaked in darkness behind a rusted-out shipping container, a tactical pack weighing on his shoulders, a calm earpiece snug against his ear. Behind him, Erin gave her weapon a final check, her whisper low in his headset. "FBI's en route. But if you want to wait..." Chris said nothing. His eyes locked on the row of shadow-drenched warehouses ahead, the place where Julia was being held. In that thick blackness, each step he took carried a silent oath. Either she walks out alive, or I don't walk out at all. The warehouse corridor was as silent as a decayed graveyard. Chris moved like vapor, slipping past light sources, hugging walls. He picked the back lock with nothing but a bobby pin and a strip of aluminum, slipping inside a place that reeked of hot metal, old oil, and fear. Julia was locked in a windowless supply room, concrete walls thick with silence, lit only by a swinging, half-dead bulb. Her hands were zip-tied, her ankles shackled to the chair, but her eyes weren't panicked. Her breathing was steady, ears tuned to every movement outside, just like Chris taught her. In chaos, whoever controls their heartbeat survives. Chris followed the layout he and Luke had mapped from old data, tracking blind spots and camera zones. When he neared Julia's cell, 2 guards stood chatting lazily, guns slung low, unaware. A quick strike from behind, a tight choke, and both dropped before they could make a sound. The door creaked open. Julia looked up, eyes lighting up, but not a word left her lips. Chris motioned for silence, knelt down, and sliced through the restraints. But then, far down the hall, a siren screamed to life. The alarm had been tripped. "They know. We run," he whispered. and just then, a voice echoed down the hall, thick and soaked in decades-old venom. "I knew you'd come, Walker." Seth Jones emerged from the dark at the far end of the corridor, a shotgun resting in his hands, eyes gleaming not with fear, but the intoxication of a predator ready to finish the hunt. Chris shoved Julia behind him, drew his sidearm. The two men stood facing each other in the flicker of dying light, past and present grinding against each other with every breath. Jones raised the barrel to Chris's chest. "You think you're going to bring it all down? You're just a washed-up soldier. I ain't the law in this town." Chris didn't flinch, voice low and steady. "You're the last disgrace ever allowed to wear a badge, and tonight that badge will bury you." The gunshot cracked like thunder across empty steel. They collided, fists, elbows, knees, years of rage, betrayal, and fury unleashed in the narrow hallway. Jones slammed Chris into the wall, their weapons clattering away. Chris retaliated, jaw tight, driving a fist into Jones's face, snapping his head back. Julia scanned the room, a door ajar, barely. Her memory kicked in. Chris's lesson: always track exits, even the ones no one else sees. She dropped low, slipped through the gap, sprinting down the service hallway, exactly the route she'd sketched in her escape notebook. Behind her, chaos. Jones lunged like a rabid beast, but Chris was ready. The first punch missed. Chris pivoted, twisting at the hips, slamming his fist into Jones's gut, folding him. But the bastard didn't stop. He yanked a hidden blade from his belt, lunging in a blur of hatred. The blade sliced along Chris's cheek, tearing flesh, blood streaming down, but he didn't back away. In the dull industrial glow, the silhouettes of the two men clashed like ghosts of a war never settled. One, driven by hatred, the other by a betrayed belief in justice. Chris pivoted, slamming his elbow into Jones's incoming blade and driving a knee into the man's side, right at the pressure point he'd learned in close-quarters combat training. Jones howled, his balance blown, and in that instant, Chris reversed the fight, flipping his opponent face first onto the cold concrete. The impact rang out like the final toll of a bell, marking the end of an era of unchecked power. Jones writhed, gasping, fingers clawing for the gun nearby, but Chris saw it coming. With one precise kick, he sent the weapon skidding across the floor, then dropped his knee onto Jones's shoulder, pinning him with unyielding force. "Remember?" Chris growled, his voice low and blazing with rage once buried. "The football field, the night you and your boys beat me half to death because I was the first black kid to make you lose." Jones spat, his voice ragged and defiant. "I've waited for this day." Chris leaned in, his breath icy against the man's ear. "So have I. But there's one difference. I don't need revenge. I need the truth." He pulled out his phone, tapped the camera on, and aimed it straight at Jones's face. "Say it, right here, before the FBI gets here, or you'll never speak again." Jones hesitated. Then, catching the steel resolve in Chris's eyes, not rage but the terrifying calm of someone who's stared down death for too long, his bravado crumbled. Okay, he panted, voice cracked and broken. We took orders from Roar, seized cars, stripped parts, sent them to the warehouse. Someone picked them up out of state. Blake covered it all. I was just the executor." Chris didn't flinch. Full names. "Say them." Sweat poured from Jones's face despite the cold. Victor Roar, Police Chief Elijah Blake, City Accountant Gina Matthews. They all knew, all of them. At that moment, the far metal door burst open. Aaron stormed in, flanked by 3 fully armed FBI agents. They froze at the sight. Chris crouched over Jones, the man mid-confession into the camera lens. Julia emerged from a side corridor and sprinted into her mother's arms. Imani had just burst in, face pale with panic. Mother and daughter collapsed into each other's embrace, sobbing, trembling under the sterile beam of FBI flashlights. Chris stood, chest heaving, and tossed the phone to one of the agents. It's all recorded, and he's still breathing. Jones lay motionless, pale and shivering. Chris, soaked in sweat and blood dripping down his cheek, no longer carried the look of vengeance, but the quiet weight of someone who'd dragged justice one step closer to the light. Aaron stepped forward, nodding once. We heard the confession on the radio, but you ended this. Chris shook his head, eyes still fixed on Julia and Imani, trembling in the beam of flashlights. No, this is just the beginning. The warehouse fell into a strange, weightless silence. But within that silence, something was shifting. For the first time, fear no longer belonged to the voiceless. It belonged to the ones who had long thrived in the dark. Beneath the slow-falling dusk over the warehouse district, once a haven for corruption, the blare of sirens echoed like the toll of a bell marking a historic reckoning. More than a dozen black SUVs and armored FBI vehicles lined the road, encircling the area like a steel barricade. Armed agents fanned out, sweeping every corner, every storage unit, every hidden passage, uncovering the raw remnants of a rotten operation just laid bare. That very night, under floodlights so harsh they mimicked noonday sun, Police Chief Elijah Blake was handcuffed and escorted out of the town hall. The expensive suit he once wore with pride was now wrinkled, its hem stained with blood from resisting arrest. Behind him walked Victor Rohr, the once untouchable councilman, his face pale as chalk, hands trembling beneath his thin coat. The local press swarmed like a broken hive. Camera lights flashed, microphones pushed toward the faces of men who had believed they stood above the law. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Rohr, do you have anything to say to the families whose vehicles were seized under your policy?" But Rohr stayed silent, his face frozen like stone, eyes darting as if searching for an exit. There was none, because every piece of data, from Jones's confession to Aaron's recovered files to Luke's money trail maps, had converged into a truth storm, shredding every lie they'd used to shield themselves. The following day, the FBI held a public press conference. Aaron stood beside the lead federal agent, presenting the evidence she and Chris had gathered. Demographic heat maps showing racially disproportionate impound rates, shell company financials, and an audio clip of Rohr issuing verbal orders to destroy evidence. But the blow that shattered the illusion came from a single video recording the warehouse confrontation between Chris and Jones, capturing the moment Jones confessed everything to the camera. Social media exploded. The hashtag #JusticeForImani flooded every platform from Twitter to TikTok, paired with the image of Julia in her mother's arms, her face still dusty but her eyes definitely bright. One moment, one image, became a symbol for every family of color cornered by violence, deceit, and systemic abuse. When the FBI convoy pulled up to the makeshift cabin where Chris's family had been hiding these past days, Imani stepped out, clutching Julia tightly against her chest, as if releasing her even for a second might make her disappear. A female agent approached, placing a gentle hand on Imani's shoulder. "Ms. Imani Carter, we're deeply sorry for what you and your daughter have endured. Your name has been cleared of all investigations. You are fully exonerated." Julia looked up, eyes rimmed with red but glowing with clarity. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, a line that drifted into Chris's ears and broke something wide open in his chest. "They believe us now, Mama. They finally believe us." Chris stood quietly in the back, his shoulders trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of a fight he thought he'd have to wage alone, now finally seen. The next morning, a private meeting was held at a federal base. military officials arrived carrying a thick dossier and a formal invitation. Chris Walker, whose identity had been erased from records under the pretense of involvement in the death of CIA agent Tom Jones, was to be fully reinstated, his honor restored. A video was played, footage from a military drone in 2014, showing the firefight at Kunduz. In the video, Tom Jones was hit by a shot from an angle outside Chris's field of fire. This was followed by internal CIA wiretaps, revealing command-level conversations that exposed Tom had been silenced by his own to cover up a cross-border arms smuggling scandal. Chris didn't react right away. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, eyes hollow. Not until an older officer placed a weathered medal on the table, the one he should have received years ago, did Chris look up, his voice low and hoarse. "It's not about the medal. It's about the truth." Erin, standing outside the room, watched him from a distance. She understood. Behind that soldier was 1,000 others who'd never been protected. Children like Julia, mothers like Amani, and soldiers whose names were buried to shield a broken system. That day, as they left the base, Julia held her uncle tight. She didn't say a word, but in her eyes, overflowing with gratitude, courage, and love, was everything that needed to be said. Systems may rot, but those who step out of the shadows will always be the ones who bring the light. After the incident, Amani became the face of a movement called Drive Forward, a fund dedicated to supporting families impacted by police overreach. The initiative helped restore access to transportation, employment opportunities, and, most importantly, a voice. Across community justice platforms, Amani's image, no longer just a resilient single mother, but a beacon of perseverance and awakening, spread as a symbol of strength. Julia grew up in the light of that love and protection. She became more confident, more outspoken, and began sharing her mother's story at community events, both as a way to heal and to inspire courage in those her age. And Chris, the brother who had once walked through gunfire, who had faced the edge of life and death, once again disappeared from public view. Like a familiar shadow in the night, he remained unseen. But Erin knew the truth. Wherever injustice whispered in silence, he would be there. He left no trace, but his presence lingered in everyone he had protected, in every silent war he chose to fight. For Amani and Julia, one thing remained certain. Even in his absence, Chris's love and watchful eye never left them. He was the quiet soldier walking through the dark, not for recognition, but to safeguard life, truth, and justice for those who could not defend themselves. The story of Amani Carter is a brave voice rising against injustices disguised as law. But it wouldn't be complete without the quiet presence of Chris, her brother, returning from the battlefield not just with survival skills, but with a heart that's never flinched in the face of darkness. When Amani was humiliated in public, it was Chris who turned that pain into an indictment of a rotting system. A woman who stood tall amid threats, and a soldier who chose to fight in silence. They didn't just protect each other, they lit a spark that urged an entire community to rise. What do you think of Chris's quiet courage? How many people like him are out there right now, quietly holding the line of justice while the world looks away? If this story moved you, hit like, share it, and subscribe, because the flame of justice must never die, even if only one person is left to carry it in the dark.